Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very honoured to be here among such a distinguished group of scientists. As has already been said, I am a historian, so please excuse any mistakes I might make when I'm talking about Lydia Becker. I think there would be nobody who would be more delighted to have had such an institution named after her, which would have been an absolute thrill to her had she been alive today. And also to see so many women in this audience, so many female scientists, because, as you'll see, that was something that was very close to her heart. So the question I put on the slide here, who is this Miss Becker, is something that you might have been wondering about, and it's certainly something that people 154 years ago asked when she first caused a storm at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in a speech that she made, which I will come back to a little bit later. And I hope that I'll give you something of an answer to the question through this little talk that I'm doing now. I put scientists first in my subtitle because although science became very much a secondary thing for Lydia Becker, it was something that ran as a theme through her whole life, and she had aspirations to be a scientist herself. And it did colour, the scientific way of thinking did colour her approach to events and issues with which she was dealing as a campaigner for women's rights. I first met her when I was teaching history in a grammar school, and her main claim to fame is as a suffragist, not as a scientist. And she was never able to do what she'd hoped to do, which was to sort out the women's suffrage question and get back to science, her first love. But it didn't happen, sadly, for her. So, to say a few words about her early life, this is the house where she lived for most of her first 38 years of life. She had a short spell elsewhere, but most of her childhood and young womanhood was spent at this house in Altrincham. It's between Burnley and Blackburn, and it's Moorside House, which was a family home built by her father. She was the eldest of 15 children. Born into a middle-class family, her family were manufacturers of chemicals, things like dyes for the cotton industry, which, of course, was the way that Manchester made its money in the 19th century. And because she was the eldest child, she was expected to be the chief assistant of her mother in looking after all her younger siblings. And her mother produced a baby regularly every 2 years until she got to 15. Very sadly, her mother died when she was only 47, 7 months after the 15th baby was born. They didn't all survive to adulthood. And in fact, when her mother died, Lydia was left looking after 11 siblings, not 14. She did have some health problems. There were problems with her back, which seems to have been weak, and she had fine motor skill problems as well. Her handwriting is appalling, which I can personally testify to, having read lots of her letters. But the other thing was, because she was a middle-class girl brought up conventionally, she didn't have formal education. Her mother taught her what she could. She did learn to read and write and some of the basics like that. But she was self-taught. By all accounts, and particularly the account of her younger sister, who wrote about her after she had died, she was a voracious reader of any topic she could get hold of books on. And she did keep a notebook early on in the 1840s up to about 1863, which were scientific notes about things like fossils, birds, also poetry she jotted down, and also politics. She was very interested in politics from an early age. But in her letters, she expressed dissatisfaction with her life. She thought it was empty and meaningless. And when her brothers went off to university, she, in a letter, mentioned how disappointed and angry she felt that this opportunity was never offered to her because she was a girl. And she never married. She spent the years when she might have married living in the countryside in Altrincham. Her sisters did get married, and it may be that because she had physical weaknesses, she was sort of designated the daughter who would stay at home and look after her younger siblings and then ageing parents. And that indeed is, of course, what did happen to her. But she did take up a new interest, and that was in botany. And this panel is taken from the door of the living room in Moorside House, and she painted these flowers on the panels of the door, which are still there. This particular one, the red campion, was very important to her for reasons which I'll explain in a moment. But she loved flowers, and we hear about how she learned all the Latin names and she always could identify them on carriage rides. She kept them in her office. She visited Kew Gardens whenever she was in London. But she also went around the countryside collecting specimens and seeds, in spite of the difficulties of Victorian dress along crinolines, would it be in the middle of the century, and inadequate footwear. But she corresponded with Charles Babbington, who was a professor of botany at Cambridge, later on with Alfred Russel Wallace, the distinguished naturalist, and most importantly with Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you're all aware of. There are 14 letters existing in the Darwin archive, mostly from Lydia, but a couple from Charles Darwin to her. And they ended up sort of jointly investigating the red campion, because she had discovered some that were hermaphrodite, and she thought she discovered a new species. Charles Darwin persuaded her and was convinced himself that this was due to a mutation because of a fungus that had infected the plants. But basically, they together investigated the morphology of this plant, and they sent specimens, and he sent papers to her that he'd written, and they were corresponding about this for a considerable length of time. In 1864, Lydia produced a little book called Botany for Novices. It was aimed at the kind of people who would never get access to the academic world, and it was particularly for other women and for children. But interestingly enough, she didn't use the Linnaean form of terminology, which was the normal thing that women did writing about flowers and plants, which referred to husband and wife plants producing floral children, and by implication sort of validated the traditional female roles by showing their reflection in the natural order. She rejected that and went for the male system of the natural naming of plants, and also concealed her gender. You'll notice that it just says LEB, which doesn't give away the fact that it's written by a woman. She was also helped by this gentleman who was actually the first medical officer of health for Manchester, who was a second cousin of hers. He was a distinguished doctor and chemist, and he helped her in her studies by sending her suggestions for books and articles that she would never have been able to get on her own. However, I don't think he really understood that she wanted to be a proper scientist, because he said it was a charming study for a young lady, and recommended a book by Mrs. Sear, a most charming work full of incident, information, poetry, and beautiful thoughts. So I think he took it as being something suitable for a lady. Nevertheless, he did introduce her to the male academic scientific world that was going on in Manchester in organisations like the LBIII, still going today. And Lydia was very, very eager to be serious and scientific in every aspect of her studies. Okay, so in 1864 also, she sent a group of flowers. She had developed a new way of drying and preserving flowers to keep their colour. And she sent a collection to the Royal Horticultural Society. It had just become the Royal one. It was in Kensington. And this was a national competition. And this is one of the actual specimens that she sent. They're in the Manchester Museum now. And you can see that even now it's still preserved its colour. And she won the gold medal for producing this collection of flowers. So in lots of ways, she wanted to be taken very, very seriously and was very keen to join in with the academic debate that was going on at the time. In 1865, the family had fallen on hard times because of the cotton famine due to the American Civil War. There was a lot of hardship in Manchester, and the family business probably was struggling because it relied on the cotton industry. And she moved to Manchester. And she wrote to Darwin that her studies from nature would have to end at this point. But she carried on, wanted to join the academic study and the theoretical study, tried to join the LBIII, but of course that was a bastion of male privilege and no woman was allowed to darken its doors. And so she decided to form her own society called the Ladies' Literary Society. It wasn't really particularly about literature, it was actually more scientific. And she asked Darwin to send one of his papers for discussion at the first meeting, and apparently he sent 3, so he was very helpful in helping her set this up. And she made the exclusion of women from the knowledge that they wanted very clear, because she said, I think it possible you may have by you a copy of some paper, such as that on the linum, which you have communicated to the learned societies, but which is unknown and inaccessible to us unless through your kindness. This is how far women were excluded from the scientific world. And in 1868, she presented a very remarkable idea to the Ladies' Literary Society. She presented a paper arguing against the received medical and social opinion of the time that there was no difference between the brains of men and women. She came to this conclusion, it seems, through the idea that if external forces, like, for example, a fungus, could affect the development of a plant, then surely external forces might affect the development of human beings as well. And she compared the stunted growth of a plant when it had no light to the stunted growth of a woman when she had no education. Now, this at the time was really, really incendiary stuff to be telling people. And it came to the notice of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And so they invited her to come to their Norwich meeting in 1868 and to give a talk there. They thought it would be a really good one for getting discussion going in a big way. She was invited to speak at the Economics and Statistics section, which was the only section where women were allowed to put papers in, but they usually didn't make the speech themselves. A man would read it out because it was considered almost immoral for a woman to stand up like I'm doing today and address an audience, particularly a mixed audience of men and women. So they invited her to speak, but she decided that she would make the speech herself, which was really, again, taking a stand. It was viewed as the least scientific section and therefore suitable for ladies, but one commentator all the same did say, the section of the economic science is hardly the one in which you would expect a lady to shine. And this slide that I put up shows a summary of what they published about what she'd said. It caused a huge national stir. Overnight, Lydia Becker's name became a household name. She was known across the nation, and people were asking the question I started with, who is this Miss Becker? Some of them were supportive, but there was an awful lot of opposition as well, as you might imagine. The Stroud Journal began what became a stream of hostile satire when they said, there are now 3 sexes, masculine, feminine, and Miss Becker. So, we come on to what happened. At the same time as she was making this speech, she suddenly became aware of politics. But, obviously, the person we most associate with women's rights and the Votes for Women question in particular is Emmeline Pankhurst. And this Manxie poster illustrates the fact that even today, it's Emmeline Pankhurst that we all think of when we think about the vote and women. And in fact, the statue that was put up to her very recently in Manchester, there was a public vote about it, which woman should be shown on a statue to go in Manchester. And Lydia Becker didn't even make the shortlist of 6. Emmeline, of course, did. And in the end, the vote was 56% of people voted for Emmeline Pankhurst. That means all the other 5 people on the list shared 44% of the vote between them. So she is massive in people's consciousness. But I would argue that Lydia Becker started the ball rolling. Lydia Becker was the one on whose shoulders Emmeline and her family were able to build. If it hadn't been for Lydia Becker, it would have taken them a lot longer and would have been a lot harder road to get to the point where women were given the vote. So I think that Lydia Becker deserves to be recognised in having prepared the ground for the later work of Emmeline Pankhurst. Lydia died in 1890, and Emmeline didn't start the suffragettes until 1903, so she is definitely quite a forerunner of Emmeline Pankhurst. So here we've got the things that she was involved in. She first came to this world of women's rights in 1866. When she'd moved to Manchester, she went to a conference and she heard the speech of a woman called Barbara Bodichon, who was involved in an embryonic movement to change the lives of women and get them more rights in work, and also they were beginning to talk about a vote as well. Barbara Bodichon didn't read the speech out, a man read it out for her. But Lydia Becker was completely blown away by it. Just remember, she'd been living in countryside in Altrincham, she hadn't been aware of all these other things that were going on. And suddenly she realised there were people who felt like her, that women should have more opportunities, have access to education, should be allowed to become scientists, should join learned societies, all these things. Suddenly she realised that she wasn't on her own. And it was a real epiphany. And she immediately launched herself into the women's rights movement in several ways. The most important one, which I'll say a little bit about first, is the women's suffrage campaign. It was hardly started at this time. There had been a little meeting in Manchester and there had been a little meeting in London of a small group of people, but it was very, very embryonic. But to her, giving women the vote was the crucial thing. She said it was the root of everything. If women had the vote, then all the other things that were not right about the way women were treated could be changed, because people in Parliament would have to listen to women because they were voting them in. And so she immediately became involved in the women's suffrage campaign, such as it was, and in fact she created it because she pushed, as a mover and shaker, for the creation of the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage. She sort of bullied, bludgeoned, argued the other people who were interested, a mixture of men and women, I should hasten to say, into forming the association. And under her, the Manchester group led the whole country. There were groups in other cities, Edinburgh, Dublin, Belfast, London, of course, Bristol, Birmingham, but it was the Manchester group under Lydia Becker's leadership that persuaded all the others to join in the various campaigns she wanted them to adopt. And the first of those was one in 1868 to prepare for the general election that was going to be that year, in which she actually used a loophole in the law, which I can't go into now, to actually get women registered to vote, women who had property that was equal to the property qualification that men then had to have. And so women all around the country were registering to vote. And in fact, it was estimated by a newspaper that up to 1,000 women voted in that election. Now, that's something most people don't know. So in that general election, 1,000 women voted, but the High Court closed the loophole and that wasn't possible anymore. She also, in the 1880s, went to London because they realised that the campaign was being led from Manchester and they wanted to lead it. They thought London should be the leader of the campaign, and they invited her to go and join them. And she went in 1881 and spent the next 9 years of her life until she died commuting between Manchester and London. In both cases, for Manchester and London, she was the honorary secretary. She wasn't the president, but because of her dynamic personality and the way that she was single-minded about everything and extremely determined, to the extent that she fell out with quite a lot of people, she actually was pushing the movement forward the whole time. So in 1869, she successfully proposed that women should be included in the voting in big cities like Manchester. And from that time on, women could vote in council elections. She also went to the Isle of Man with Alice Scatcherd, her colleague, and helped to persuade the Tynwald to vote, to give women the vote on the same terms as men. So from 1881, women in the Isle of Man voted the same way and the same terms as the men did. And again, something not very well known. She became the only woman on the Manchester School Board for 20 years and was particularly keen to push the education of girls, and particularly science for girls. The government had been in its bonnet at this time that girls should do more and more needlework. And she hated needlework and campaigned against this. But in the end, it was very difficult to overcome. But in the end, she did have some successes, as we'll see a bit later. But she was very keen on science for girls. She also campaigned that married women should have rights to their own property, which they didn't have in the 1860s. There were a couple of laws in the 1870s and 1880s that eventually changed that, but she was the treasurer for the campaign for that. She also campaigned for women to have rights at work, not ordinary women, women working at the pit brow and coal mines, women who were seamstresses. She was interested in ordinary women, and that they should be allowed to join cooperatives and engage in commerce as well. And finally, pulling all this together, she was the founder, the editor, and the chief contributor to the Women's Suffrage Journal, which she started in 1870, and when she died in 1890, it ended. I think because nobody else wanted to take on the huge burden of actually doing all that work. It was a very, very big undertaking and very successful. And it wasn't just about the suffrage, about votes. It was about all these issues. and had sections on everything that concerned the rights of women. So a very important thing in linking together all these campaigns and bringing people together. The response was sometimes extremely hostile. And perhaps for us today, it looks a bit mild. But at the time, for women who were used to being sequestered at home, to be presented in the press in an unpleasant and humiliating way was really frightening and really unpleasant. And Lydia Becker hated seeing these kinds of things. But the fact that she appears in Punch in 1870 without being named shows you how much of a household name she was, that people knew who she was. Miss Becker, Lydia Becker, is the woman in the middle with the glasses at the front here. She always has steel-rimmed spectacles, and that's how we recognise her. The women are battering at the door of Parliament, and we've got John Bull there, the symbol of, you know, the fat, rich parliamentarian, holding the door closed against the women, and they're waving bills for women's rights and bills to get women to vote. Now, if you look carefully at how Lydia Becker and her friends are portrayed, they are ugly, they look aggressive. If you look at her feet, she's showing an unladylike ankle with quite big feet. So it's impugning her femininity, impugning her behaviour. This is not ladylike behaviour. This is reprehensible, awful women. At the time, there was a newspaper that characterised these people as the shrieking sisterhood. So they really did get a lot of stick in the press. And actually, if you notice the ladies at the back on the right, these are proper ladies. Little tiny feet, no ankles, looking embarrassed at what their dreadful shrieking sisters were doing. That's how ladies should be. Yeah. So this is just one example. I could show you loads more. But this is a particularly a good example because it sums up the whole problem, really. So she found this very unpleasant and scary. This is Laura McLaren, and she was the woman who invited Lydia to go to London. She was actually from Manchester, Salford. Her parents were the mayor and mayoress of Salford, and they were huge women's suffragists. And so she married the son of another suffragist, the leader of the Edinburgh group. So she married Charles McLaren, and she went to London because he was an MP. And she persuaded the London group to invite Lydia Becker to go to London to lead the campaign from London. And they made Lydia Becker the chief parliamentary agent and lobbyist because Lydia Becker by this time was a total past master at all the arcane rules of parliamentary debate and so on. And so they felt they needed her in London to try and get a bill through that would give women the vote. There had been bills proposed every year from 1870 right through to her death in 1890, except for 1 year in 1874 when there was a bit of a glitch, which I won't bother with now. But basically, they wanted to keep the issue alive. And Laura McLaren decided that Lydia should go to London. You might have come across her if you've ever been to Bodnant Gardens, because Laura McLaren was also of the family that owned Bodnant, and she had a hand in laying out the gardens as well. Well, Lydia Becker, as I mentioned, died in 1890, and it was a very sad death, actually. She was weakening when she was 61, and she decided to go eventually for a rest cure in Bath, where the doctor diagnosed, interestingly for you, diagnosed that she had osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. And then she decided, having improved a bit, that she would go to the continent, and she travelled to Les-Bains, and seemed to be doing very well. There are letters that she wrote home and postcards, and she was fine. But then she contracted diphtheria and very quickly got very ill. The doctor where she was recommended that she should go to Geneva to see a specialist. It was a 5-hour carriage journey, and she was feeling dreadful. In fact, she wrote to her maid, couldn't speak. She wrote, "I'm not going to make this." Anyway, she did get there. When she got there, the specialist wasn't in. She waited around and died waiting to see the specialist that evening. So, you know, she died alone, really. I don't think she even knew the maid very well. I think she'd hired her for the journey to be respectable. So she died very much on her own, which was very sad. So, how did Becker's work change the political climate? Why is she important? Well, first of all, she undermined this idea of separate spheres, the idea that women should be at home and men should go out into the world, which was the normal view of most people at that time. She went, for example, making lots of speeches all around the country, in London too, and became a very good orator, was noted to be a very effective speech maker. And this laid the foundations for other women at the time to follow her, some of them not as good. But of course, later on, the Pankhursts took up that tradition. And by the time they came along, it was accepted that women could make speeches. She offered a political education to working class women. When women got the vote in the cities, she actually ran meetings to explain to them how you fill in the papers to apply to vote and register, how you question the candidates, what issues there might be that you could ask them about, and so on. And of course, she said, you must always ask them if they're in favour of women having the vote. She made sure that a women's suffrage bill or a resolution was presented to Parliament every single year, except for that one in 1870. So the issue was kept alive. People couldn't forget about it. And from being a matter of ridicule and innuendo, for example, one MP in 1870, in the debate about the first bill that was presented, dismissed the whole idea of giving women the vote as ridiculous and unnatural. It was like, he said, teaching dogs to dance. And that was considered a perfectly acceptable thing to say in Parliament at that time. By 1890, when she died, this was considered unacceptable to say things like that. And also, most MPs agreed that it was rather a question of when women would get the vote rather than if. They had come round to that idea that it was something to be seriously discussed, and whether you were against it or for it, it was going to happen at some point in the future. So as early as 1890, this was the common view at that time. And here I've just noted a few of the really high points that she achieved. I mentioned already the 1,000 women who voted in the general election of 1868, the huge circulation, relatively for the time, of the Women's Suffrage Journal, the women who could vote in 1869 like the men in the cities, the girls beginning to study science, the higher Manchester board schools in the 1870s, they were winning prizes by the early 1880s, the voting in the Isle of Man for the Keys Parliament, and also petitions, huge petitions, 343 signatures. And this isn't like today where you go on the internet and you just click to sign. This is like you go around to everybody's house and you get them to write their name and address. And in fact, there were women who were putting crosses, so they asked them, working class women as well. And this idea that working class women weren't approached at all until the suffragettes is not true, really. So she achieved a lot of important things. But of course, ultimately, the ultimate goal was to get women the vote, and she didn't succeed in that in her lifetime. There was too many obstacles to it at that point. And of course, that was a reason why later on she was forgotten about, because it happened under the watch of the suffragettes. But Emmeline Pankhurst, in her autobiography, certainly valued the work of Lydia Becker. And just finish with this quotation. She described her as the Great Miss Lydia Becker. That's the title of my book. A splendid character and a truly eloquent speaker. And certainly Emmeline did recognise that she owed a debt to Lydia Becker. So I would like to see her reinstated in the pantheon of great women campaigners. And I think you're doing a very good job towards that in naming your institute after her. So I'll conclude my remarks there, but I just want to say that I've been asked to tell you that those people who are receiving a book, I will be downstairs, and if you come to me, and if you want a signature, and then I will sign it as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Joanna, for a really fascinating talk. Actually, I've learned a lot about Lydia Becker there. Does anybody have any questions for Joanna? Tracy.
I remember when we spoke before, we mentioned about why Emmeline Pankhurst was popular and very well known and Lydia Becker wasn't. Mm. And that perhaps it may be down to her appearance and her nature. Do you expand on that in the book?
I don't think it's so much her appearance and nature, because, I mean, they were both actually, had quite a lot in common in some ways. They were both very keen on dressing well. One of the things Lydia Becker was very conscious about was that if, cartoons weren't going to impugn your femininity, you had to be very careful to look right. And her first speeches were absolutely swamped by people who wanted to see this weird, what they thought would be a manly woman, because that wasn't the sort of thing women did. And she was very conscious to try and dress well. And the other thing about falling out with people, I mean, Emmeline did lots of that too. So I think the reason that Emmeline and the suffragettes have sort of overshadowed her is, A, because they seem to have succeeded. They were very good at self-publicising their own campaigns at the time and also later on. And they had the merchandise as well. You know, there was suffragette jewellery and, you know, the sash and the slogans and all that kind of thing. They were very good at actually catching the public eye in that way. And, of course, their campaigns were so spectacular. When it became violent and they were slashing paintings and desecrating golf courses and trying to burn people's houses down, that was red meat to the press. Whereas, you know, having meetings and signing petitions is a bit less exciting if you're a newspaper reporter. So I think it was that kind of thing. And then after the vote was got, I think there was a lot of suffragettes who were busy writing that it was them. I mean, there's a lot of debate amongst historians about how much the suffragettes helped and how much they actually hindered. There is some people who would argue that had it not been for the suffragette campaign, it might be that women would have got the vote before the First World War. So, you know, there's a lot, and there's no answer to that. It's going to be a matter of opinion. But so I think it's more to do with the way that they were very, very good at putting their cause across in that way.
Dan's got a question, but while you're getting the microphone, did she continue her scientific work after she got involved in politics, or did that have to take a back seat? It took very much a back seat, but she did. I know, for example, she wrote to Alfred Russel Wallace once in 1885, I think it was, about beetles. Because somebody had asked her a question and she was sort of finding out for them. But I think by and large it did go by the board because she was so immersed. And she was a very single-minded person, which I think probably you have to be when you're starting a new kind of campaign like that. She was very much a steamroller and was very focused. So I don't think she did an awful lot with the science. But she always said, I'll be really glad when we've got women in the vote so I can go back to my science. So she really was in her heart. And sometimes when she was talking about things that were happening, like a split in 1888 in the movement over whether married women should be specifically mentioned in their campaigns to have the vote, I won't go into why that was. But she basically said, it's like when you look at an embryo and then it divides into two cells and they each go their own way, or into two separate entities, and they divide and go their own way, and they both thrive because there's been a division. And she sort of interpreted it in a scientific way of thinking.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the problems is celebrating people of that time, even great scientists, is they have pretty horrific views on race. Do you know what her views on race was? And another question would be, from digging into her life in such depth that you did, reading all her letters, what did you personally gain from that?
Sorry, what do I personally?
What did you personally gain from
reading?
Digging into her life? Like, did you reflect on your life in some way?
Right. Okay. So to take the first one, she never said anything that was overtly racist, and I don't think that she was particularly so. Yeah, I mean, I think she was probably a woman of her time in that, for example, she was a big supporter of the British Empire. But, of course, that was, you know, the conventional view at that time. And she even, in fact, when Gladstone decided to go for Home Rule for Ireland in 1886, she left she'd been a Liberal up to then. She decided she wasn't going to be a Liberal anymore. She joined the Conservative Party because they were the party that would defend the integrity of the empire, and she regarded the idea of giving the Irish Home Rule as the beginning of the end of the British Empire. So she was certainly didn't regard the empire as a bad thing, which I think we might interpret as being racist today, but she never actually said why exactly she supported that. She just thought it was part of Britain's greatness. I don't know if she thought that deeply about it, to be honest. In terms of my own feeling, I think I just really, really enjoyed finding out about her life. And I was curious about some things, like, for example, like, you know, you wonder about, what's somebody's religious beliefs? Because the 19th century, people often were very religious, and it had a great bearing on their thinking. But she was actually a free thinker, and very modern in her views, really. She didn't begrudge anybody else who was religious, but she wasn't religious at all herself. I was also interested to find out whether anybody ever actually to marry them. And I didn't find any evidence that they did, but she did say in one letter that she'd like to get married as long as her husband would treat her as an equal. And she had quite revolutionary ideas on marriage. She believed that wives should be paid for their looking after the home and the children, and that it should be a completely equal relationship between husband and wife. And again, at that time, those ideas were very revolutionary. She also had a very quirky idea about voting. She believed in universal suffrage, that everybody should have a vote, including children. She said in one letter, I think as soon as they are able and willing, they want to vote, they should be able to. It's a right of living in the society, and it's like having the right to walk, she said. So she had the idea that, perhaps, 11-year-olds might vote. So, yeah, she had some quite quirky ideas, which were quite interesting.
Is there any relatives or anyone connected to her alive now?
There are relatives, I think, in Canada, and there might be others that I haven't come across, because obviously not having children herself and having so many brothers and sisters who, married, and it's a long time ago. So I don't know. I haven't pursued the family tree side of things particularly, because that's hugely time-consuming, and I was focusing on her. But there certainly are some relatives around in Canada. Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on? Just to say a huge thank you again for a really interesting talk. I think everyone has to rush out and buy the book to displace Dan off the bestseller lists. And we've got a Netflix series, I'm sure, in this, at least one of these.